Hello, and thank you for joining us today for another video in our lecture series at the Institute of Ismaili Studies, Unexplored Sources and Uncharted Territories, hosted by the South Asian Studies Unit. My name is William Hofmann. I'm a research associate here at the Institute. And today we have Dr. Ayesha Sheth, an assistant professor at the School of Arts and Sciences in Ahmedabad University. Ayesha Sheth is an historian of early modern South Asia, specializing in courtly culture and polity formation with a particular focus on music, literature, and comparative knowledge traditions in South Asia and the broader Persianate cosmopolis. She received her PhD from the Department of South Asia Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research interests span performance studies, early modern literatures, indigenous histories, and mercantile histories of South Asia. She is currently assistant professor at the School of Arts and Sciences, Ahmedabad University. Alongside teaching, she is also developing two research projects, one on the Gond kingdoms of central India, and the other on the role of Jain mercantile networks in early modern literary and cultural circulation. Today, Ayesha will be presenting on Familiar Raags for unfamiliar audiences, the development and diffusion of musical knowledge across Jain and Islamicate contexts. Starting in the late 14th century, music treatises composed in Sanskrit began to describe rags, or melodic modes, as male or female figures, complete with detailed descriptions of their attire, ornaments, and aesthetic qualities. These vivid characterizations gave rise to the ragmala, or garland of ragas, tradition, initially a form of musicological verse that subsequently inspired a genre of painting, where artists visually interpreted the descriptions. By the 16th century, Ragmala verses also found their way into literary works like Kutban's Mrigavati and Jayasi's Padmavat. While the artistic and poetic beauty of the Ragmala tradition is well recognized, this presentation focuses on the role of the Ragmala as a pedagogical device. The 14th to 16th centuries in South Asia saw the rise and circulation of individuals of various linguistic, cultural, and socio-religious backgrounds. Within such a multilingual and multicultural landscape, this presentation considers how the development of a ragmala form facilitated the simplification of musical theory and allowed for the diffusion of rag music across the diverse intellectual audiences of early modern South Asia. Thank you, Ayesha.
Thank you, William, for that introduction. I'd also like to extend my gratitude to Hussain Jasani and the Institute for Ismaili Studies for inviting me to this conversation on music, rag, and ragmala. Let us begin. The 14th to 16th centuries was a significant period in the history of South Asia. Politically, the decline of the Delhi Sultanate and the rise of polities from Gujarat to Bengal and from Kashmir to the Deccan marked this period as what is widely known as that of the regional kingdoms, and you can see that on the map in front of you. This period saw the migration and circulation of both social and cultural elites across geographies, creating alternate and overlapping networks of patronage and artistic activity. Alongside groups of Afghans, Turks, and Rajputs who came to acquire political power, we also see the circulation of Sufis, itinerant soldiers, powerful mercantile guilds, and a range of poets and musicians who moved from one court to another in search of new patrons. As can be imagined, such circulation also led to the development of new genres and styles of music, art, and literature that were integral to ideas of self-fashioning and to the development of a political ethos for these new elite groups. It is with these crisscrossing networks of people, language, literature, and music in mind that I begin my presentation. I shall focus particularly on the region of Gujarat in the west and the region of the northern Gangetic Plain, tracking the development of a particular musical form, the ragamala. Simply put, ragamala, Sanskrit for garland of melodies, refers to a genre of poetic verse and painting that visually describe the melodic form rag. The 13th century Sangeet Ratnakar, composed by Sharangdev, was the first to classify rags into masculine, feminine, and neuter, based on the affects they produced. Masculine rags were to be sung to evoke feelings of passion and heroism, for love, humor, and sorrow, the feminine rags, and neuter rags to induce terror, abhorrence, and peace. The text also assigns specific seasons and times for the singing of rags. The earliest text to describe rags as anthropomorphized forms each with specific sartorial and ornamental characteristics, was the Sangeet Upanishad Sarodhara, composed in 1350 by the Jain scholar Sudha Kalash. For example, Shri Rag has a fair complexion. He has 8 hands and 4 faces. He carries a snare, a lotus, a book, a gourd, and the fruit of a citron tree. In 2 of his hands is a veena, a music instrument, and 1 hand grants beneficence. He is known for having a swan as his vehicle. He is like a form of Brahma. Along with visual descriptions, Sudha Kalash, the author of these verses, also grouped his rags into a parivar or family, composed of 6 male rags, each of whom was accompanied by 5 female raginis. So on the slide in front of you, in red, you see what are the male rags, and below them, their raginis or wives. It was this family system that became the basis of the theoretical framing of subsequent Ragmala texts, although the particular melodic modes included in each category of the system differ between text to text. By the 16th century, musicologists across North and Central India were using the Ragmala form to describe the musical modes about which they were writing. The Ragmala form, however, was not just a musical device in poetic verse. About 100 years after Sudha Kalash had composed his text, the iconographical details held within his verses were transposed into the medium of painting. And we have the earliest Raga visuals found along the borders of a 15th century Jain manuscript of the Kalpa Sutra. What began here as simple representations of the musical modes in the form of gods and goddesses soon blossomed into a complex visual form, and by the 17th century, Rags and Raginis came to be represented as princes, warriors, lovers, and sages. And so on the slide in front of you, you can see 2 17th century paintings, and at the center that of Rag Shri from the Kalpa Sutra. And it is at once discernible the kind of iconographical differences and the development that takes place. Scholars are uncertain about what exactly led to the development of visual characterizations of such Rags and Raginis. A few, like Alan Miner, have suggested that the descriptions may have drawn inspiration from Jain incorporations of tantric practices like goddess worship and the chanting of mantras, while focused on other visual forms that was taking place between the 11th and 12th centuries. Setting aside this question of origins, much of the scholarship on Ragmala has been focused on its circulation in the 17th and 18th century Mughal and Rajput courtly milieus, where the Ragmala circulated widely as musicological theory, poetic verse, and painting. While Mughal historians have deliberated on its entanglement with Persian aesthetic theory and courtly culture, art historians have focused their discussions on iconographical styles and textual fidelity. My presentation today, however, is focused on the early life of the Ragmala, particularly its development and subsequent circulation between the 14th and 16th centuries. First, I examine the development of the Ragmala form by reading it alongside other changes that were simultaneously taking place in musicological writing between the 14th and 16th centuries. And second, I examine its circulation during this period along a network of Jain merchants. In doing so, my presentation considers how the development of the Ragmala form may have facilitated the simplification of musical theory and allowed for the diffusion of Rag music across diverse intellectual audiences, particularly Jain merchants and Sufi communities of early modern South Asia. Before we return to the Sangeet Upanishad Sarodhara, however, let me state 2 observations about musicological texts at the turn of the 14th century. What is significant for the purpose of this paper is that the system of organizing rags into families marked a significant departure from older treatises that organized such melodic material within a scalar system that used tonal textures to differentiate between rags. So let me explain what I mean. For example, the 15th century Sangeeta Raja by Maharana Kumbha states that Raga Shri, who we encountered in Sudha Kalash's verses, belonged to the Shadja Grama, had Sa or Shadja, the first note, as its primary note, and lacked or rarely used the 5th note Pa or Panchama. Such was the popularity of the Ragmala form that from the 16th century onwards, music texts started presenting their discussions on music almost exclusively in such descriptive verses, using the terms raga rupa, form of the rag, raga dhyana, meditation on rag, or ragamala, garland of rag. It is significant to note that in many of these texts, raga verses contained next to no tonal information and were instead solely devoted to iconographical descriptions of rag in poetic verse. Many of these treatises, thus, though musicological, present as poetic compendiums of raga verse, and we encounter more of these texts as we move into the 17th century. Such an epistemological shift, one that saw musical modes being described and transmitted not through scales and notes, but through aesthetic and affective inscriptions, went hand in hand with a shift in the audiences of musicological texts. This becomes evident from within the texts themselves, which increasingly address themselves not to music knowers, skilled musicians, or the wise, as texts composed prior to the 13th century were wont to do, but instead declared that they were composed or compiled for the pleasure and knowledge of their patrons, to spread the knowledge of music, to educate those who were ignorant, to solve the problems of the students, and for the benefit of everybody. And in the slide in front of you are epigrams from some of these texts, which then declare who they're writing these texts for. So keeping these 2 points in mind, let us turn to a closer look at the Sangeetopanishad Sarodhara. At the time that Sudha Kalash was writing, the region of Gujarat was subject to Tughlaq power at Delhi, first under Muhammad bin Tughlaq, who ruled between 1325 and 51, and soon after under Firoz Shah Tughlaq, who ruled between 1351 and 88. Recent scholarship by Stephen Vos and Basil Leclerc, amongst others, has shown that Jain intellectuals maintained close relations with Sultanate rulers, or Turuka Rajya, as they were named in Jain texts. The opening image of this presentation too, taken from a 15th century illustrated manuscript of the Kalakacharya Katha, again a Jain text, shows the Jain monk Kalaka requesting the help of Shaka princes, referring to princes from the region of Persia, to rescue his sister from the king of Ujjain, a town in central India, the king whose name is Gardabhilla. Not only is Muhammad bin Tughlaq known to have issued farmans protecting Jain temples from harm, his successor Firoz Shah is documented to have interacted with Jain intellectuals, and in 1370 even commissioned the Jain monk Mahendra Suri to compose a treatise on the astrolabe, the Yantra Raja Agama. While it is unclear from the text whether Sudha Kalash had access to this kind of courtly environment, he does make mention of mlecha, or foreign instruments like the dhola, tabla, daffa, tamki, and daundi, pointing to a sustained influx of Persianate musicological influences within his local soundscape. Barely 25 years after the Sangeetopanishad Sarodhara, an unnamed author composed the Gunyat-ul-Munya in 1375, the earliest Persian treatise on music, for Malik Shamsuddin Ibrahim Asin Abu Raja, the deputy governor of Gujarat during the reign of Firoz Shah Tughlaq. A brief comparison of the section on instruments in the 2 texts reveals a common set of instruments that were current in Gujarat at the time. The desire to educate the unaware and musically ignorant, as we saw in the epigrams in the previous slide, is perceptible in the Gunyat too, which frequently makes equivalences between Sanskrit and Persian musical terminology. So the authors gloss Naad as Awaz, Sur as Ahang, Geet as Sarud, etc. In the section on instruments, the compiler of the Gunyat writes, Gagari, double-surfaced, hollow in the middle, open-mouthed, similar to the kunar. And on top of that, 2 linked rings. And pea-sized iron pellets are thrown inside to make a sound. It is like a jalajil. Elsewhere, he describes the kahali. Like the dhatura flower made from copper in 3 cubits, the sound is hoo-hoo. Not only did the compiler provide the material makeup of the instruments, he was careful to provide Persianate or Arabic equivalents, as in the case of the ghagari, which looks like the juljul. In addition, he makes visual comparisons, as with the kunar fruit or the dhatura flower, using local or Hindvi words, and, as in the case of the kahali, explains what the instrument sounds like, hoo-hoo. These descriptions gave to the reader or listener a basic musical vocabulary, familiarizing him with the elements of performance that may have been current in the courtly environment and soundscape of 14th century Gujarat. So nowhere does the compiler actually tell you how these instruments are played, and instead is just giving you visual and oral descriptions. Might it be then that the Sangeet Upanishad Sarudhara, in describing Rag Shri visually rather than in tonal terms, was attempting to present musical knowledge in more accessible terms? The intent to simplify music knowledge is evident across Sudha Kalash's text. For example, he prefaces his discussion on rags by acknowledging that although there are a total of 16,000 rags, he describes only 36, so that they may be discernible by those who are ignorant. And the word he uses is alpa buddhi, meaning one of small mind. Sudha Kalash provides no tonal information on his rags and raginis, and instead, as we saw with Rag Shri, provides only an iconographical account of every musical mode. As an aside, the absence of technical terms and tonal information may also suggest that these texts were more concerned with listeners rather than actual musicians. That the Ragamala form may have been intended as a teaching tool is further supported by the visualizations of Sudha Kalash's verses on the margins of the Kalpasutra manuscript. The Kalpasutra, a Jain text containing biographies of the 24 Tirthankaras, is typically recited during the festival of Paryushan, held every monsoon season, and is of great ritual importance to the Shwetambara sect of Jains. From about the 15th century, diverse patrons, most of them belonging to mercantile guilds, commissioned lavishly illustrated Kalpasutra manuscripts, of which many had images of rags and raginis on the margins. A well-known example is the Devashano Pado Kalpasutra, dated to around 1500 and most likely produced in Patan in Gujarat. The incomplete colophon of this richly illuminated text mentioned members of the family of one Dev Shah, belonging to a banking community and presumably a respected minister at the Muzaffarid court of the Gujarat Sultanate, which at the time was under the reign of Mahmud Begum. The circulation of Ragamala images, in contrast to their courtly context in the subsequent centuries, first emerged within these Jain intellectual networks, spread across the western, central, and the northern regions of the subcontinent. If we contrast the figures of the early Kalpasutra with these later recreations, we can also appreciate how context may have determined the form these Rag images took. It is plain to see, for example, the divine beings of the 1475 Kalpasutra, so here, seem to acquire a more court-like iconography in the Devashano Pado copy, and the Raginis are on the margins, so the two women standing at the ends of both the folios in front of you. It is also likely that the artists of this Kalpasutra may have also worked for the Gujarat Sultans and his court, thus imbibing other influences learned at court. And so although this is not an area of my expertise, certain features of the painting also seem to suggest the influence of painting techniques from Iran, so from Persia, such as the use of lapis lazuli, the blue that is used in the manuscript, the use of gold, especially alongside a black background, and this kind of interlocking flower panels in the border. In addition, architectural remains from Gujarat mosques patronized by sultans and their governors, as well as temples and stepwells endowed by Jain merchants, display a shared aesthetics that suggests that local sculptors and artisans were increasingly becoming familiar with Persianate styles and incorporating them within existing Indic styles. While the function of musicological texts within a Jain ecumene is uncertain, and there is not much work done, or at least not much recent scholarship on music within Jain contexts, what is evident from literary and inscriptional references is that music and dance, like for many other communities, constituted the ritual life of Jain laymen. In early texts from about the 7th to the 9th centuries, music and dance are described as part of the ritual functions carried out in Jain temples and are deemed as part of the meritorious actions to be performed by Jain laymen. A Sanskrit inscription from 1387, engraved on the ceiling of the altar or the mandapa of a Jain temple dedicated to Tirthankar Vardhamana in Tamil Nadu, makes reference to the construction of a great hall for performance, a Mahamandapam Sangeet Artham, paved with stones all around. Most medieval Jain temples included a Ranga Mandapa, a performance hall, in front of the inner sanctum, and there are references to performances in such spaces in literary texts composed between the 11th and 14th centuries. The Sangeet Mandan, a musicological treatise composed by Mandan for the Mandu Sultan Hoshang Shah, who ruled from 1405 to 32, contains a detailed description of a 7-storied Ranga Mandapa, where kings watch dances by skilled performers. So just like Sudha Kalash was also within the courtly space of the Tughlaqs in Gujarat, here we have another Jain scholar, Mandan, who wrote for the Sultan Hoshang Shah. Mandan, a prolific composer, also wrote a series of other texts, including the Shringara Mandan, the Kavya Mandan, which are literary texts, and he belonged to the Shrimala sect of Jains. His Sangeet Mandan too contains Ragamala verses, although he calls them Raga Rupa form, and he does not organize them alongside familiar lines. In his description of Raags, Mandan, like Sudha Kalash, provides iconographical descriptions, although he often also gives tonal information. And thus he describes Turushka Gaudi, a melodic mode that most likely combined Indic and Persianate musical techniques, or was at least performed by varied members of the Ghorid court. And he writes, Turushka Gaudi has ni as its dominant and final note and does not employ the note ga, the second note, the third note. It is performed with low notes. It is curious that a large number of the treatises composed between the 14th and 16th centuries, particularly those that employed Ragmala forms, were composed in regions that were also prominent Jain trade centers. So I'm just going to open up a map for you. In the town of Kada, in north, slightly to the east, a mercantile center within the Jaunpur Sultanate, the Sangeet Shiromani was composed by a group of scholars for Malik Sulata Shahi, a governor of the Sharqi Sultanate under Sultan Ibrahim Shah. This text too contains a simple Ragmala form. Although it uses the organizing principle of 6 rags accompanied by 6 wives, it provides a melodic definition for each rather than a visual one. Maharana Kumbha's Sangeeta Raja in Mewar in the west contains raga descriptions in addition to tonal information. Although not Jain himself, Maharana Kumbha was a patron of Jain architecture, as is evidenced in a series of inscriptions on 15th century Jain temples in the region of Mewar, and is most likely to have maintained a close relationship with the Jain mercantile community, given the financial resources at their disposal. And I'm giving you examples of these different Ragamala texts to also make the point that different texts contain different kinds of information. So when we come across Ragamala texts which have just tonal information or even just iconographical descriptions or both, it must also prompt us to start thinking about what kinds of audiences interacted with such texts. If we were to think for a moment of the wide Jain mercantile and religious networks crisscrossing the Gangetic plain, extending westwards to Gujarat and in the south towards Malwa, and map it against those musicological texts and images that contain Ragamalas, it is evidence enough to suggest that the development of the Ragamala and its movement across varied regions took place squarely within Jain mercantile networks. Further, most of these texts, the Sangeet Upanishad Sarodhara, the Sangeet Mandan, the Sangeet Shiromani, were all composed within kingdoms that were ostensibly ruled by Muslim kings, all of whom were patrons to a vibrant social and intellectual courtly life. The Ragmala form, however, did not remain exclusive to musicological treatises, and Rag-Ragini verses soon began to appear in literary narratives as well. Let me conclude then with a well-known example from Sheikh Qutban's Mrigavati, a Sufi romance narrative or Prem Akhyan, composed in the North Indian vernacular of Awadhi around 1503 for Sultan Hussain Shah Sharqi of Jaunpur. So the Mrigavati is also written in the same courtly space as the Sangeet Shiromani. Let us examine an excerpt from the Mrigavati that describes a concert organized for the Prince Rajkuvar and his close companions. The instruments sounded all in rhythm and played the 6 complete rags. Their 30 wives, the Raginis, were sung 5 by 5 after each rag. First, they sounded a single note, then began to play Rag Bhairav. They sang Madhumadhavi and Sindhura, then beat time to Bengali and Bairati. After that, they sang Gunakali complete. These are the wives of Bhairav. Only Deepak was left out by then, for they knew it harms the singer. They only sang Deepak's 5 wives, which grant liberation when sung. They rendered Birashi Chanda, Kamodaka, Deshi, and finally Patamanjari, said to be the cycle. These are called the wives of Deepak. Then it was the turn of Rag Hindol, which they played with 5 wives. They sang a wondrous Bairari, then played Deshak and Nataka in time. When they sang Samyukta and Deshi, they completed the cycle of Hindol. In the 6th place, they set Rag Shri and sang the high notes pure and clear. Then they sang Hemakali, Malari, followed by Gujari and Bhimpalasi. These are the wives of Rag Shri. Kutban describes a rather charming concert at the court of Prince Rajkubar. The music performance, and verses are not here, begins with the handing out of pan or betel leaf and the royal command. What follows in 9 extremely detailed verses is the listing of instruments and their sounds, a ragamala of 6 rags accompanied by 5 raginis, a description of dancers, a list of genres and rhythmic cycles that were performed, and concludes with the rewards showered by the prince onto the performers. It is quite likely that Qutban was writing about music as was heard and performed at the court of Sultan Hussain Shah Sharki, where the Mrigavati was composed. And many of the rags listed by him are recorded in the 2 contemporaneous texts, the Sangeet Shiromani, which I have already mentioned, and the Dastur al-Shuara, a manual for poets composed at the end of the 14th century. While Qutban's Ragmala recorded the melodies that may have been in circulation, or at least those that ought to be performed in a royal assembly, it also alerted its audience that Rag Deepak, believed to have the power to cause combustion, was to be left out due to its harmful effects. Now, although we have no evidence for this, it is worth considering at least how audiences may have learned to distinguish one rag from another, a skill that requires training and practice even today. Similarly, while we have records of what was heard or ought to be heard, we do not fully understand how such auditory skills were learned. It is tempting to speculate, therefore, on the anecdote of one Ahmad Khan, the Mukti or governor of Jaunpur, during the reign of Sikandar Lodi, who ruled from 1489 to 1517. The text Waqiyat al-Mushtaki records that Ahmad Khan would often visit the Talim Khana-e-Akhada to give instruction in music. However, it does not specify whom he was instructing. Not being a musician himself, it is unlikely he was teaching musicians who are mostly recorded to have learned from other more renowned musicians. In addition, it may have been in breach of courtly etiquette to mingle with musicians who were seen to belong to an inferior class, as is evident in later texts like the Mughal Mirza Nama. Presumably then, he might have been instructing fellow courtly members. Musicological texts of the Sultanate period rarely, if ever, recorded details of musical connoisseurship as done by later Mughal texts. A few texts delineated at best how the musical sabha or assembly was to be organized, giving specific instructions for the decoration of the stage, the positioning of the musicians, and the placement of various functionaries in the assembly, their rank in direct relation to their distance from the king. The mores of musicological connoisseurship were confined, however, to the mirrors of princes genre, which was seen to be the purview of courtly elite, and in literary texts, such as the Mrigavati, which circulated more widely. Sufi premakyans, like the Mrigavati, were often read aloud in public spaces, in addition to being performed in private mehfils. So Badauni has recorded the public reading of verses from Mullah Daud's Chandayan, another Sufi premakyan, and this public reading of verses takes place by Sheikh Taqiyuddin Waiz Rabbani from his pulpit. On the other hand, the Jain merchant, the 17th century Jain merchant Banarasi Das, also recounts that he and his friends often read from Manjan's Madhumalati, yet another Sufi premakyan, together. Thus, beyond the confines of the codified treatise, musicological knowledge circulated in literary texts, which were often publicly performed. Scholars of Bhakti, so Bhakti scholars too, incorporated raga lists as an organizing principle in Bhakti poetry compilations. In other compositions, such as Krishna Das Kaviraj's 16th century Shri Govinda Leelamrita, a Vaishnav Bhakti text describing the amours of Radha and Krishna, we encounter a similar listing similar to that of Qutban's. So in the 22nd Sarga on amorous play at night time, or Nakta Leela, the gopis entertained Krishna and Radha. They sang the 22 Shrutis, the 7 Swars, the 49 Tans, and the 21 kinds of Murchanas. They sang with 7 Sampurna voices, 6 Shada voices, and 5 order voices. These refer to 7, 6, and 5 notes, respectively. They then sang the Raags, Mallara, Karnataka, Natta, Sama, Kedara, so on and so forth, and the Raginis one after another. If, as Richard Williams has shown in a recent essay, music pocketbooks containing quick references to melodic structures and iconographies of rag were produced in 19th century Bengal for the connoisseur who was expected to be familiar with musical vocabulary, then we can also view the proliferation of Ragamala texts with simplified musical knowledge as a kind of reference guide of sorts for the aspirational individual of the 14th to 16th centuries. If advice literature in the form of akhlaq or niti texts advised kings and princes to be musically knowledgeable and maintain a musical court, the development of the Ragamala form from the 14th century onwards may also be understood as a way by which the transmission of codified familiar knowledge was being effected amongst unfamiliar audiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayesha, for that fascinating talk. There was quite a lot that I saw there that really overlaps with a lot of the research that we do here as well. And I just wanted to ask you particularly about this idea of texts as pedagogical devices. How much do you see that Ragnala changes between courtly and devotional contexts? Is there a simplification of specialist musical knowledge? If we read into what sort of audiences are listening and reading to these texts, can we tell anything about those audiences?
Thanks, William, for that question. So, of course, and as we saw in the texts that I spoke about as well, the kinds of rag knowledge or the intensity of rag knowledge that comes in both courtly texts and in devotional texts is quite diverse, and which is why, although I was not looking at devotional texts in particular, I was trying to highlight that even within the musicological canon, rag knowledge is of different kinds, and therefore you have some texts, like say, for example, Maharana Kumbhas, which have tonal descriptions. So they give you what notes were used for these rags, in addition to iconographical descriptions. And I must add here that Maharana Kumbh's visual descriptions of each rag directly borrow from Swadakalash. So there's also an intellectual lineage of within musicological canon that's taking place here. While that is happening at one end, there are other Ragamala texts that simply just give you verse or like iconographical characterizations, or others like Kutban's Mrigavati that just give you the names, right? So even within a series of texts composed in and around the same period, you have different kinds of raga knowledge that is being recorded. And particularly, we must think of the kinds of contexts that these texts are seeing, right? So in a text that's composed for a courtly audience, and we must remember here that the courtly audience we see in the 15th through 16th centuries is not the kinds that we encounter later in the Mughal period. These are members of courts who are newly coming to power, right? So we are seeing regional governors who are patrons of texts, quote unquote new kings. And what I mean by new kings are that these were like members of other clans or like commanders of armies that come to power with the decline of the kind of central political power. And these are members also who might not have been knowledgeable of how it was to be at court, right? So you have a circulation of these texts that are actually giving them the tools of how to present themselves at court. And so within this as well, if you start looking at who the text is addressing, right? So that is why that kind of slide with the epigrams of they're no longer addressing scholars or knowledgeable people. These are ignorant people or unknowing people who the text is trying to make them familiar with what they're going to encounter at court. On the devotional side, on the other hand, as far as I have seen in at least Jain and Vaishnav Bhakti texts, verses are often appended with raga inscriptions, but they don't have any other kind of tonal information. So in light of that, one would have to already be familiar with what does it mean when verses say, okay, now it's Ragini Sorati or Ragshri or Bhairav. You have to already know what that is. And in these cases, I do believe that there is evidence enough to suggest, and I'm also drawing on contemporary performances by members of Kabir singers or like Satpanti communities, or even the Langa Manganyars or the Sindhi Sufis who also employ rags in their performances. But their texts or even their conversations, they just say, we are going to sing Sorati, we are going to sing Gurjari, which I think functions rather much like a mnemonic device, alerting them to what kind of tune has to be performed for the verse. But as to other kinds of detailed expressions of what rasa or bhava or aesthetic quality these verses might embody might be different from other rag texts, or at least more technical texts that are more concerned with these affective descriptions. So there's a kind of diversity in the kinds of knowledge that circulate, that get presented in these texts.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really fascinating, especially if we look at, specifically Sufi context and as well as Ismaili context, that the sort of Rag knowledge that we find there is often not really defined as well. So, I mean, in the earliest sort of, large texts that we have of early Hindi Sufi verse, they're organized in Rag, but there's the sort of thematic associations are quite non-generic. But we can really tell where those, maybe some of those sort of concrete aesthetic associations are coming out when we read things like Malfuzat, which are sort of discourse texts that were written primarily in Persian for Sufi audiences, where they might talk about, a rag is being sung during the monsoon or something like that. But it's often doesn't necessarily show up when we have larger collections of devotional texts that are also organized in rag. I'm thinking particularly of the work that Rupert Snell has done on Chaurasi Pad of Harivansh.
It's interesting you bring up monsoon rags, because that's often the one and the only kind of ascription that comes up, right? We're all just familiar with rags that ought to be sung in the monsoon, rags that bring about rain. But what are the other rags doing? Where is the concern with that? And it might also be interesting to think about these monsoon rags in context of work done by, say, for example, Deepti Khera, who works within an arid landscape in Rajasthan, where there is an overwhelming concern with the monsoon, with water. Where is it going to come from? And is it going to be there? So one could also put down these kinds of overwhelming associations with an actual material need and of like water, and a concern of when the monsoon is going to come. And on the flip side, the monsoon is also the only time when people stop moving. So soldiers do not go to war in the monsoon. Merchants don't roam the lands during the monsoon. That is why the Kalpa Sutra is performed and read out in the monsoon period, because everyone is in one place. And so, alongside kind of aesthetics, one must also take into account material everyday lives of this music. And so not just to kind of go into an aesthetic kind of discourse, which a lot of kind of Sufi texts have been studied with aligned to that, but also to remember that these Sufis were also often other kinds of people as well, right? So there's a multiplicity in identity as well. So a Sufi is not just a Sufi. Many of them often begin as merchants. And so even our kings and sultans begin as merchants. I think Behlul Lodi was a horse trader, right? So there is a different kind of circulation, a different kind of milieu that these individuals are circulating within. And so we take a more complex narrative into account when even thinking of what such kind of musicological knowledge is doing as well.
Yeah. No, I mean, particularly in the texts that I look at in Sufi texts, they're usually Rag Malhar is the only one that really comes out as the most evident, at least in Malfuzat texts. There's usually a Malhar, and there's usually some sort of reference to it raining. And it's really fascinating, actually. One of the sort of earliest stories we have of cabals and the power of music from singers or cabals in both Sufi and court contexts is Kaval's singing so that it might rain, essentially, and Sufis organizing sessions of sema, or sort of spiritual audition, so that the rains might come. And that really shows us the affective and actual actual power of music, or the idea of this power of music. But it's also really interesting that you mentioned the sort of these mercantile networks, because when we look at early Ismaili communities as well, a lot of these were mercantile communities. And when we look at Ginan texts, we see a little bit of a usage of Raag more as mnemonic device, essentially. So there are Ginans that might have Raag as a sort of organizing feature, but the texts themselves might not necessarily map out onto what we know as the aesthetic connotations of these different Raags. Like we have some of the earliest ones we have are Raags Sob, Saveri or Sameri, and Dhanashri, which are more sort of found in Langa Manganyar and also Kachi Sindhi musical practice, essentially. So I really like this idea of Raag as a pedagogical device, but through different networks and through different audiences. And I think this really came out in your talk as well, that the sort of these devices are used in different ways for different audiences.
I'd also just like to point out, you just reminded me of a recent conversation I was having with kind of Goswami scholar, so like the head of a Pushti Margi social group, who was referring to a bunch of rags that we only find in Ragmala lists. And even some of the rags that you're mentioning and the Sufi Manganya kind of context, these rags actually don't show up on the concert stage. And so it's also interesting that actually even today, a lot of rag knowledge, or what this gentleman wanted to call our ancient music, is only held in more kind of what has been popularly called folk music, but traditional music compositions, and which were predominantly orally learned and passed down. And so there's also that in itself is showing you that Rag is playing like a pedagogical tool. And so they won't say that, oh, let me sing you such and such composition. They'll always say, let me tell you a song in Deshak. Let me tell you a song in Patmanjari. Just Rags I have never heard on a concert stage. So that in itself is an interesting thing as well.
Yeah, and also the Rags really change as well. Their tonal associations and how they're played change quite a lot, both regionally and over time. I mean, even if we look today at modern day Ginan recitation, looking at those Ginans that show up in maybe 17th or 18th century texts as being in certain Rags, and then you hear their recitation today, the recitation styles and sort of melodic contours change between recitation. Those sort of mnemonic references to Raag might not even show up in different texts. So it really depends on both, who the scribe is, who the audience is, where and how these texts circulate, which I think is
well,
really
it could also explain why there are so many different kinds of Shama or so many different kinds of Gaudi, because you'll say, I'm going to sing a Gaudi, and then you'll sing something. I'll be like, well, that's not actually Gaudi. Well, you come from a Persianate space, maybe it's a Turushka Gaudi, and you're just doing this differently. And then it becomes a variation. So you could also think of it in those terms as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Raag knowledge really changes both, as I said, regionally, but also, between what we think of as we might say folk music and classical music, and rather than really setting up this dichotomy, I think it's good to also recognize that forms of knowledge are different in different communities and different networks. I'm thinking particularly, as you mentioned, that Dastur al-Shuara, there's some very specialist knowledge that comes out of that in a very literary text, a text for sort of Persianate literati, but it's specialist musical knowledge that we can't actually understand without being musicians ourselves, and without understanding how that musical knowledge circulated and was performed at that time. And so it's actually a very difficult text to decipher because of that. So, as you said, there's a sort of diffusion of knowledge. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how that diffusion of knowledge works as Ragmala texts circulate? Do like these sort of visual depictions, do tonal depictions, if they mention anything, change as these texts circulate between networks? And
sorry, do they mention if things change?
When you see that these Ragmala texts and verses circulate through different texts and through different literary networks, does that knowledge change? Yeah.
While they don't actually say whether things change or not, they'll often tell you that, well, this is what has been described in earlier texts, a tradition that I am very much a part of. But since in this region it is not sung this way, therefore I will describe it in such a manner. And therefore even Sudha Kalash says that, there are these prabandha forms, but no one really sings or understands them anymore. And therefore I'm not going to discuss them, and I'm only going to discuss Geeta or music or song, And so they won't, at least within Shastra, within this technical genre of musicological writing, to acknowledge that you're deviating from what is tradition is a big no-no. So even when you're trying to weave in change, when you're trying to respond to what you're listening to, you'll often build it within the contours of the text itself. And so, for example, the most common example is that of this distinction between Marg and Deshi, which within literature gets classified as a kind of cosmopolitan vernacular, a kind of high-low. But within musicological texts, Marga is described as the music which is the part of the realm of the gods, and Deshi is Itilok, in Iyam Loke, right here, right? And is music performed for not just kings, but also cowherds and ignorants and children. So their audience itself, the moment they begin with saying, now I'm going to explain Deshi music, they're telling you it's music of this time and this period. And therefore, they'll acknowledge that there does exist this form, but we don't need to touch it because that's not something that we're concerned with here. And so that in itself, that's how they weave in like how things change. And so they'll never say that, yes, we're doing something different. They'll either say something is incorrect or, well, this is how it's done. Even in historical texts, so Barni often will say that, this is not exactly according to the precepts of Islam, but these are special times and these are difficult people that we're governing, and therefore we must do this, which is, against our principles generally, but now we have to go with this way. So it's also interesting how they put that into conversation, but you do see multiple different kinds of systems, which kind of begs the questions, what exactly is going on out here?
Yeah, no, I think it's really fascinating because it's the perennial complaint of the theorist is that the musicians don't actually know the theory. I mean, that you see this in 16th century texts in Sanskrit, you see it in Persian, you see Persian musicological texts really rationalizing music theory in a way that these theorists themselves say, this is not how it's used in practice, but this is how it's, scientifically perfect or something like that. So it's quite fascinating that then, as we saw in your talk, that different levels of specialist knowledge either get added in or taken out as these verses circulate, which really says something kind of about there might be a way in which we can read a sort of bifurcation of the musician and the theorist really through these texts, which also tells us something about our own scholarship that, in a way that these theorists are erasing musicians. And I think it's a great way to understand that we also need to now bring back the musicians and the actual practitioners. And, this has been something that's been used even more recently in the recent past, but it's something that's been happening, for millennia, essentially.
Yeah, it's true. The anxiety for fidelity to text is just incredible, and you see it across the board. Like as you pointed out in the past as well, but even today, what do the musicians know? They don't even follow Shastra, not realizing, well, the Shastras themselves are changing. So really, and a lot of them are changing to like responding to what they hear, right? So even in Catherine Schofield's work on the tambur, the veena, etc., you see khayal changing. In your own work, you see things transforming. And those transformations are always placed in the context of the circulation of the text. This moved along a Sufi network. It went to Gujarat. It did this. It did that. So it is actually Laukika or like worldly practice that is kind of informing what then becomes Shastra, so to speak. Yeah.
Can you say something a little bit more about how these texts were produced and circulated within mercantile networks? I'm thinking specifically about how both, Jain and Ismaili communities in a place like Gujarat were sort of centered around mercantile communities, and how Raag knowledge might be known amongst both mercantile and devotional communities, and how that then, we've seen how it sort of changes in the more elite courtly contexts.
Well, this is a bit of a speculative answer, and requires a bunch of work at my end as well. But even I was quite surprised when, like, the first iconographical description is in a Jain text, and I was like, okay, fine, maybe he's just a musicologist doing musical things. And then you see that the Ragamala form only crops up in Jain texts. Actually, even all the texts that I mentioned are even housed at the Jain repository in Patan. So, the afterlives of these texts are also following an intellectual and mercantile predominantly tradition. Why the visual description comes to be like that's still like an open-ended question. I think it's following from earlier musicologists like the Brihadeshi, which is already doing some kind of, gender work. Sangeet Ratnakar is giving, at least the notes are given, a vehicle and a presiding deity and a lineage and a caste and a color, etc. And so maybe they're like picking on these elements. What might also be interesting is it is actually in the Jain mercantile space that manuscript illumination or like illustrations first really pick up. And a lot of these, if you especially turn to scholarship on, like, say, visualizations of the Chanda and the Kalpa Sutra, they'll talk about like Jain contexts in Jaunpur, which have informed the illustration. So a lot of the Sultanate paintings are often compared to Jain iconography. And so I think it's these longer mercantile links, and I'm sure there are Ismaili communities as well, which I must mention that although it is difficult to find early modern mentions of Ismaili communities, they often get written as Khwaja and Shahs, and then later you have to kind of discern that these were actually Ismaili communities based on other kinds of information. So it's a kind of challenging history to excavate, to write, basically, because you have to constantly read very much into these nitty-gritty details. But I think that these long circulation patterns actually bring in kind of new musical influences and discussions. And so I remember coming across a letter in the Cairo Ghanizah papers where this merchant is discussing, he's actually written a letter. He's gone from Gujarat to Cairo. He's in whatever, circulating in that area. And he writes back saying, these are the accounts, etc. And by the way, if you have some money left over, why don't you bring some strings? And the word uses a very technical word for instrument strings. And so, it's this merchant, his primary motive is not to deal in musical instruments. There's nothing we know about his musical life. But in his letter, he's asking for strings. And so there's this kind of, alternate life for it's just kind of incidental, actually, that music also circulates along with these individuals. And so, when we think of music histories, we're constantly just thinking of who is singing, who is listening, what is looking beautiful, etc. Not realizing that these could have also been part of everyday kinds of movements and transformations. Even we listen to music while we are on the subway or on the bus or whatever, right? So these things are constantly going in and out. And so there's also a place to consider these kinds of individuals, the merchants, who are actually bringing in the material for these instruments, for books. For books to be composed, you need paper. Where is the paper coming from? Where is the ink? The lapis lazuli is, I think, only mined in what is now Afghanistan. So there's, color coming in from there. If you're illuminating something with gold, that's a lot of money, right? Because and it's also a very fine technique of getting those thin layers, etc. So I think when you think of this musical world and when you pay attention to this material life of the text or of the performance, it really kind of blows it up. And this is where merchants really come in. And merchants are also one of the few members who move easily across courts, right? Because who doesn't want a strong financial kind of backing. So the merchants are moving from court A to court B. They are never suspected of being spies. So you even have a story told in the Mastere Mahmud Shahi, I think, of Hoshang Shah, who disguises himself as a merchant to kind of go into the forests and into Bengal, right? Because he has to pretend he is a mobile character. So he pretends he's a merchant. And so I think by ways of these kinds of networks, things really move unimpeded in some sort of way. I won't say that it's completely free. And so rather than thinking, oh, why was the merchant singing? It's better to think of, well, what was happening when he was moving? What was he carrying? Where was he coming from? And so, which is why when I started plotting these texts on a map, it was like, it's actually funny because I was reading the Vividha Tirtha Kalpa, which is, I think, a 13th century text, and it's basically a pilgrimage text, and it describes all the Jain pilgrimage centers. And as I was kind of going through the text, I was like, wait, hang on. These are the very same places the Ragamala texts are cropping up. And so when you blow them up on a map, it's suddenly like just one-on-one. And, it makes you think about another kind of network by which these texts, these images are moving and are also comprehensible by these members, right? Banarasi Das is a 17th century merchant, and he is very much a musical scholar. He's also writing poetry and often gets scolded for it, as he writes in his autobiography. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think it's just a great way of kind of examining what's important, what musical knowledge is important for different communities as texts circulate. Thank you. Thank you, Ayesha, so much for that fascinating talk. It brought up a lot of questions for our own research here. I think for Ismaili studies, it's really great to also know what's going on in similar places, such as in Gujarat and in similar, mercantile and literary networks, where all these networks are really, speaking to each other and also singing to each other in some way. It's really fascinating. It'll be quite, I think, influential on bringing together different areas of scholarship. So thank you, Ayesha, once again for that fascinating talk. This has been the Unexplored Sources and Uncharted Territories lecture series at the South Asian Studies Unit of the Institute of Ismaili Studies. I would like to thank, first and foremost, Hussein Jassani, the head of department, for his support in organizing this series. I'd like to thank also our director, Professor Zain Qasim, for her support. I'd also like to thank the Institute of Ismaili Studies comms team. And I'd also really like to thank Asif Murji of the Aga Khan Council of Canada for all of his technological help today with the webinar. Thank you once again to Ayesha for that stimulating talk and discussion, and thank you as well to our audience for joining us today. To conclude our session, I would like to invite you to tune in for our upcoming webinar in the Unexplored Sources and Uncharted Territories series, which will be delivered by ethnomusicologist Brian E. Bond, who will be speaking on a thematic music, the melodies of Shah Jo Rasalo in contemporary Sindhi music performance. Thank you.